Hi, welcome again to Chapter 8 now. Chapter 8 is a pretty short chapter, and it's where we're going to look at some things. I don't think this is overly complicated, but you do need to understand Chapter 7 before continuing on to Chapter 8. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you. So this is my motto right now, Carpe Diem, Quantum Minimum Credula Postero. So there's our translation. And right now, with things changing day by day, minute by minute, I just kind of thought this was a little bit appropriate. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start on Chapter 8. Chapter 8, what we're going to do is take a look at how taxation impacts total surplus. And we're going to see that we find that in this section of welfare economics that things are not as easy as what we had said, nor are things as efficient as what we have said. So remember, kind of back from what we've talked about before, so let me just annotate this a little bit. Let's see, okay. So remember, a tax levied on the buyers is where we manipulate the demand curve, okay? And again, we find that reference point. In this chapter, you can actually shove the tax wedge, that shorter way, that quicker way that I had talked to you about. If the tax is levied on the sellers, then that's when we add the tax, and the supply curve is the one that we manipulate. Now, remember that it doesn't really matter who the tax is levied on, because what really happens is that, let's see if I can get this to advance. So yeah, there we go. Okay. The outcome's the same. We end up with this price wedge. And I think this is why we're kind of saying the short way is the easier way to go now. And so, again, we get a wedge. So we can use that tax wedge, that quicker way, to kind of see what happens in the graph. The overall implications of this are the same. So the price paid by the buyers rises. Remember that the buyers, the price that they pay is always on top. The price received by sellers falls. And this is the main part that we want to discuss here, is that the quantity equilibrium can no longer be reached. So this is no longer an efficient market by what we say in economic theory. Okay, let me erase that, and then we'll go on to our next slide. Okay, so we're going to see how the tax affects this. Now, don't forget about elasticities. Remember, it's really important to remember that the inelastic side of the market will always pay a larger share of the tax because they can't pass that on. So if supply is more inelastic than demand, then sellers are going to pay a larger percentage or a larger proportion of the tax. If demand is more inelastic than supply, then buyers are going to be paying a larger share of the tax. Okay, so here we have the effects of a tax. Notice that they did use the tax wedges. Just a couple important points to remember. And the first one is that the price buyers pay is on the top, price sellers receive is on the bottom. This would be our traditional price equilibrium, the price without the tax. Then what we do is shove that tax wedge in. And remember, to shove a tax wedge in, let's see if I can do this. There we go. To shove here's the amount of the tax is right here. Okay, and we really just took a wedge, kept it vertical, and kept shoving it in until it touched the demand curve and the supply curve. The main thing to look at here is notice that the quantity with the tax is substantially lower than the quantity with the tax. So what we're going to say is that this market, once you impose a tax wedge, the market is no longer efficient by economic standards. Okay, so we have three basic players in this scenario. We have the, let's see, we've got the buyers, they are affected by, they get less consumer surplus. The sellers are affected because they get less producer surplus or profit. The government now gets some tax revenue from the tax wedge, and we'll take a look at how those things are actually calculated. Okay, so this is a good representation, I think, of basically how a tax wedge impacts the market. So originally, consumer surplus, let me see if I can put some, yeah, let me go ahead and put a price equilibrium in here. Okay, let me go ahead and do this. Okay, good. Okay, so this is price equilibrium. And originally what we had, so without the tax, consumer surplus was this larger triangle that you see right here. Remember, buyers always come first, so consumer surplus is always the top triangle. Consumer surplus originally without the tax was this bottom triangle right here. What the tax wedge, or creating a per tax on an item, what it essentially is doing is now consumer surplus is just this smaller triangle here. Producer surplus is this smaller triangle down here. And the government is going to collect the tax revenue of this pink rectangle. Okay. Now we're going to see later on that this larger triangle right here represents what we like to call deadweight loss. And we're going to see that in some upcoming slides. Oh, let me erase everything I did here and go on to my next slide. Okay, so this is kind of important. I think students tend to understand the overall gist of it, but what they don't understand is exactly where these numbers or this change, sometimes the chart down below can be a little bit confusing. So let's talk through this, and yeah, let me do it. Well, let me do it this way. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to see is that the original without the tax was consumer surplus was originally this blue triangle. Producer surplus, let's see, producer surplus is going to be this pink area denoted by D, E, and F. Okay, so that was our original without a tax. Go ahead and clear that. Now, since the tax has been enacted, we have lots going on here. So A is going to be, let's see what would be the best way, probably this. A is going to be the new consumer surplus. Look how much it's reduced by B and C. So B and C are now eliminated from consumer surplus. Likewise, F here is going to be producer surplus. Notice how much that's reduced. Okay, so now it's been reduced by D and E. We now have a new box that we haven't seen previously, and that's B and D. And B and D represent basically tax revenue. Okay. Now, just to note that our new total surplus, so down here, total surplus, is going to include what the government has. So total surplus in this chapter, I want you to think of it this way. It's going to be consumer surplus plus producer surplus plus tax revenue. So that's a little bit different than what we've seen previously. We're also going to be talking specifically about these two areas, C and E. And these are determined, or what we call these are deadweight loss. Specifically, the top section represents consumers that have left the market due to tax. Okay? We also can take a look at E. And E represents those producers that no longer supply due to the tax. So C and E together become what we call deadweight loss, because that's the inactive portion of the market. Also note too that when we look at the difference between Q2 and quantity equilibrium, Q1, that this market has substantially lessened. I mean, quite a bit, really, when we think about it. Okay, let me go ahead and erase the annotations here. And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So this just summarizes basically what you saw on the previous slide, kind of uses text to do that. I think sometimes working through it, talking through it becomes a little bit easier. Also maybe worth note on this particular slide is the idea that when there is no tax wedge, total tax is zero. Okay, and I think that's commonsensical, but I think it's worth noting. Lastly, the other reason why we kind of don't like this in terms of the idea of is this market efficient is that because we have reduced both consumer and producer surplus, total surplus is no longer maximized. Okay, so those are the two kind of really important points to note on this particular slide. Excuse me. Again, loss of surplus, and then we get this new term, that kind of deadweight loss. And just to kind of make sure that we understand what it is, it represents the consumers that no longer buy due to tax, and it also represents producers that no longer sell due to tax. Okay, so our overall message here is that taxes do tend to distort market incentives. What do we exactly mean by that? We mean that those consumers that value this product most highly no longer are able to get it. Because some of those consumers, excuse me, some of those consumers have dropped out of the market because of the tax. We're also going to say that, grab that, come on, those producers that are most efficient are no longer able to supply to the market. And again, if you go back on the previous slide, you'll see where those two sections of deadweight loss, one's attributable to consumer surplus and the other one's, consumers that have left the market. The other one is attributable to producers that have left the market. So let me go ahead and clear this and go to the next slide. So again, taxes cause this deadweight loss. And again, the main reason that we're saying that this is inefficient is because some trades are not made. So basically, if I could boil this down, I would say, hey, the quantity with tax is no longer equilibrium. Therefore, we would say some trades are not made, so this market no longer is efficient. Okay, now going back to this idea of only at quantity equilibrium, or in this case Q1, is the value to the buyers equal to the price to the sellers. I'm sorry, cost to the sellers. So only at Q1 is the value to the buyers equal to the cost to the sellers. In this particular example, what you're seeing here is because we have the tax, which is now at Q2. If we follow this line of Q2 up, here's the value to the buyers, here's the cost to the sellers. So in this case, what we would say is, in this scenario, the cost, to the, I'll get it right, to the sellers is always going to be greater than the value to the buyers. Okay, so that's what happens in this particular scenario because we're, less than equilibrium. Okay, let me stop sharing. Okay, so that basically sums up what we're looking at. Remember that taxes, that individual buyers don't think about taxes separately from price, even though they're two separate things. If you impose a tax on an item, what that basically means is that the price has become greater to the buyers. That's why we tend to see that buyers will drop out of the market. In our next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about deadweight loss, and then we're going to talk about how elasticities impact the deadweight loss in a market, and more specifically, which is more impacted, consumer surplus or producer surplus. Until next time, stay well. Thanks.